Hi, my name is Kelly Fleming. I'm a research and policy analyst at the Policy Institute for Energy, Environment, and the Economy. I've been working here for about 2 years on all things related to energy and transportation policy, but today I'm talking about state automated vehicle policy. And I'm interested in this question based on some of our previous published reports out of the Policy Institute. So previously, the Policy Institute has published reports and policy briefs recommending policies that will result in the best possible outcomes for AVs. So if you've read the Three Revolutions, that would be considered the heaven scenario where transportation, including self-driving cars, are low emission or electric, shared, and equitable. So we're helping people get around while reducing our emissions, and these are shared vehicles generally. So in this analysis, we were inspired by the National Conference of State Legislatures database of legislation at the state level on AVs. We performed an analysis on the database to find trends related to what types of policies were being enacted. Using this analysis, we formulated recommendations for states to begin developing and preparing for more widespread public deployment of AVs. The NCSL compiled a database of state executive orders and legislation, which is comprehensive for each of the bills and actions that were passed. We analyzed each of those bills and executive orders to determine how restrictive or permissive the action was, and at what stage the legislation is for implementing standards, regulations, and guidelines. We also utilized the Global AV Atlas tool which was put together by the Aspen Institute and Bloomberg Philanthropies to determine which states currently have AV pilot programs that are ongoing. So this did not include pilot programs that had not launched as of April 2020. This map that is similar to the one you can find on the NCSL database. As shown, the states in the light green have enacted legislation of some kind through their state assemblies. States in the darker green have enacted executive orders related to AVs, and then states in the blue have both legislation and executive order. States in the pale yellow have not enacted any policies through legislation or executive orders. So in total, 40 of the 50 states and DC have some form of policy related to AVs that has been enacted, and many more have been introduced. So we wanted to know a little bit more about what motivation and outcomes were coming from this legislation and orders. So we gathered data on which states have actively operating pilot programs, and those are shown outlined in purple. The first trend that we noticed through the policies that have been enacted were that a lot of them were related to platooning laws. So enacted legislation related to platooning is most often the removal of following too closely laws for vehicles operating in platoons. That's most likely going to be utilized in the long-haul trucking industry. So states that have enacted policies that are only related to platooning and they haven't enacted any other policies are shown with stars. There are 9 states that only have policies related to platooning and 17 states in total that have some sort of policy related to platooning. The next trend we wanted to investigate was how permissive or restrictive the policies in each state were. So we came up with a scoring system, which is shown here. A score of a -1 indicates a restriction, meaning level 4 or level 5 AV is either banned or requires a driver that can take over the operation of the vehicle at any time. A score of a 0 indicates that there's no legislation, which defaults to federal guidance. A score of a 1 indicates the state has basic AV policies that will establish preliminary steps, recognizing that AVs are in the near future. So that could be a study on impacts, a committee that's designated to investigate impacts, or designating an authority. A score of a 2 is more permissive, where a policy removes restrictions like following too closely. And a score of a 3 is the most permissive, where a policy explicitly makes AVs legal on public roads, but without guidance or regulation for minimum standards. This map shows how each state scored on our scale of permissive or restrictive. States with a ban or a restriction are shown in red with a score of a -1. The only instance of this was in the District of Columbia. States in the gray do not have any policies. And depending on how you interpret that, it could be the most permissive score since it defaults to federal guidance, which there is none at this time. In the light blue, states scored a 1, meaning they have preliminary rules or studies on AVs. And this is the most common status where states are with AV policy. The middle shade of blue shows states that scored a 2, meaning they're removing restrictions. There are 3 states in this status: Arkansas, Alabama, and Ohio. And then states in the dark blue scored a 3, meaning they're authorizing the use of AVs without any regulations. 2 of those meet these, which is Arizona and Illinois, and that's generally to attract AV operators into their state. The next thing we were interested in was regulatory policy related to AVs. So this map shows the regulatory status of each state using 2 metrics: whether they have regulating policies and whether they have regulatory authorities. So states in the pale teal have not taken any regulatory action by designating an authority or passing any policies. States in the darker teal have designated regulatory agencies for AVs, either for testing and licensing or for business or both. And then states in the blue have enacted policies with regulatory guidance like testing approval or minimum safety standards. States in the dark blue have both authorities and agencies, as well as legislation. Most commonly, states have designated the state DOT to lead a study or impact to implement these policies. And then state DMVs are also commonly designated for testing and permitting. And because AVs will impact many different areas of society, full implementation of policies to meet every goal for the heaven scenario will require multiple regulatory authorities. So based on the analysis we performed, we laid out recommendations shown in the roadmap here. Some states have already implemented parts of this, but most are only in the preliminary steps, and none have adopted the entire roadmap, which may require more action from the federal government. So first, states may implement some preliminary legislation. This could be a study or commission, or a temporary restriction or ban until more is known. Next, states could start implementing requirements and standards. And in the absence of federal policy, states could establish minimum guidance that can be used for interoperability between states. Following any regulations that are implemented, authorities in charge of enforcing those should be designated. Ideally, the federal government would implement some of these to be designated through the US DOT and the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, but in the absence, states should designate state DOTs to oversee some of these laws and testing standards. We also need to implement environmental regulations that could be designated to state environmental protection agencies or air quality offices, licensing to DMVs, etc. And currently every state has a regulatory body for transportation network companies. So if AVs are used as a service or a public good, many of those will just transfer over from transportation network company authorities. And with that, I am done with my analysis, and I'm hoping that it has informed any policymakers out there or states on what each other are doing and help them get in contact with each other to start implementing more policies that can be used in the near future to ensure that we have the best possible outcomes for cars in the absence of drivers.